welcome to another edition of the Blue and Gold Gridiron Show, where this week we continue our deep dive into the coaching carousel about to be spinning, and it's already spun at Maricopa, but we are going to talk to various ADs on what coaches can do to separate themselves in the interview process, and some other questions in there. We'll dive into a lot of topics, the head coach's role within the school community, all sorts of different things that we will discuss on here as we get into this. This has been a series a lot of people have seemed to enjoy. Coach is our third AD we've had on, and we're excited to get his perspective on this. We've had different size schools. We've had some bigger 6A schools at a 4A school, and I believe Maricopa is in 5A, if I'm not mistaken. We'll try to, at some point, get some of the smaller schools on here as well. But before we dive into the topic at hand, we're going to take just a moment to remind you that the Blue and Gold Gridiron Show is brought to you by School Funder. School Funder, the only online fundraising company in America that lets you keep all of the money your team raises. You would never give away 20% of your proceeds, or your wins, excuse me, so I'm not sure why everybody gives away 20% of their fundraising. So call the good people at School Funder. That's SCHOOLFUNDR.org. Let them know the Blue and Gold Gridiron Show sent you, as it'll help the show. So we're going to get right into it, because I listen to a lot of podcasts. I like to make sure we keep our one little ad under 2 minutes so we can get right into the topic at hand. So we have the athletic director at Maricopa High School, Mr. Matt Smith, on the show. And Coach, believe it or not, way back when, long time ago, before I was the head coach here, I applied at Maricopa. I think it might have been when Chris McDonald got the job. I'm not sure exactly, but it's been a few years. Been up here, long time, great place to be. But I'm excited to have you on the show and have your insight on the show. So take a few moments and kind of walk us through we usually say your football journey, but I'm not sure what you did athletically, so we'll just say your athletic story. So take us through that if you don't mind.
Sure. Actually, mine is more of an international football. I've spent most of my career in the soccer world. I've coached various collegiate programs, starting Division I at Northwestern State in Louisiana, working at community colleges. Spent 20 years at Corona del Sol High School, coaching girls soccer there. So that's kind of my background in that world. So it's a little different perspective, I guess. When I was at Corona, their football was kind of up and down, but I was there through Sam Duane Jr. and back-to-back state championships, and watching what basketball did to drive programs there. Really, I taught for quite a bit, taught in the South Mountain High School. So I spent 16 years at South Mountain teaching and coaching at Corona, which is kind of a tale of two different worlds. And then got into admin with the idea ultimately that I wanted to be an athletic director. That's it. That's the goal. I don't want to be at a district level. I don't want to be a principal. This is the dream world. So I spent the last couple of years, I'd been in Phoenix Union, spent the last couple of years in Tempe Union as a dean at Tempe High. Tempe's went through a lot of job cuts and things, and my position wasn't cut, but I kind of had a conversation with admin there about it was time to start looking for where I really wanted to be and what I really, really wanted to do. So I went through, ironically, last year 16, 17 interviews through different places, different jobs, different admin jobs, trying to figure out. So I sat for about 8 months on the other side. And then the ironic part is when I got this job, I didn't actually interview for it. I applied, but I had interviewed the week before for the dean job here. And after I went through that part, I got accepted, offered that job. And a week later, they called me back and said, in your interview, you mentioned athletic director. Are you still interested in that? And so we worked through that, and I did a new interview with the district AD in that part. And July 1st, I walked in here with my first day, and they said, you don't you don't have a trainer and you won't have a football coach come the end of the season because Tevin Rutherford, who was our coach, had just gotten a dean position at one of the middle schools. And so district's policy is you can't do admin and coach. And he did what I think is one of the most credible things you'll find. He said, I can't leave my boys in July. That's not right. And they said, you're right. So they gave him through this season. So I did walk in knowing, like, hey, this is where we're going to be at the end of the season, which is part of the reason why we moved ahead a little earlier than some other people would have. We weren't in the our coach is getting let go or that kind of situation, or our coach left. We knew what was coming.
That's really interesting, especially considering, like I said, you guys were kind of forward thinking, because I know in every sport, I think you want to get on campus or at least get to working with the possibility of doing that, or setting up meetings and letting kids kind of know what's coming as early as possible. So I think that's very forward thinking of you guys, and some interesting stuff there. But we'll get into the first question, and I have said this, and I thankfully am at a job I don't plan on leaving until I am done coaching, but I am not sure that I have an old school resume. I think, like I said, I think there's some decent stuff on there, but since I've been at Preston a long time, I've been able to sit in on some interviews, and I've seen some of the stuff people can put together with computers and video resumes, and there's a lot of really cool stuff that I was like, wow, that definitely separates them. So my question is this, and this is more in the screening process, not the interview process itself, because for a lot of head football positions, there's a ton of guys that apply. What do you think somebody can do to kind of separate themselves in the screening process?
I think one of the biggest things to start with is in our particular case, when we post that, is reading through that. Like, one of our big parts is, and I believe this from the beginning, is I wanted somebody on campus. And so being able to blatantly, clearly show me that you could be a teacher on campus, what your qualifications were, what you were certified in, those things, that was a big step in our screening process, because we were like, if I don't, it's just, even having Tevin this past year, who's in our district, but at a middle school, made it tougher. You don't have that immediate person on. So, I think one of the things you can really look at is like, what are they writing in that job description? Is there anything in that job description? And I would highly recommend look at some other job descriptions in the district and see what common things there are, because some of the common things are probably district pieces. Like, we're going to have this, but when you start to read the specific things, like we had, ability to coach or teach on campus. Like, when you see those things, I think you want to emphasize those. You want to make sure they're clear, so that we're not, when we're screening through those, we're not looking for what's hidden in there, And we had the people in the spots to put in their certification, so it was clear as day. And we did have some who came in with like ability to be certified by, and that opened kind of the door through them. So I think that's the first piece. The second piece to me really was how clear you are in your employment history. If you've been a coach coming up, you're going to have bounced around a bunch. It's just the nature, right? I moved from this wide receiver job, and I got a coordinator job, and then I did this. Clear dates and clear times on how they come together. And then if there's holes, it's all right if there's holes in there. Just maybe in a cover letter, maybe in something, explain that part. Casey Day, who we hired, had moved from St. Louis into Arizona, and so there was this 6-month period of just working a job, waiting to get into schools, waiting for a season to come in so that he could start into some of those. And you could see that in his description of writing from, moved here, blah, blah, then I got into coaching again, and here's where I'm going. So I think having that clear path laid out helps a lot in the screening process, because when you're looking at a lot of numbers, you're almost looking for where are the holes, where are the problems, where are the red flags that could be there. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, we've heard from some other ADs, and they've mentioned this, that particularly somebody that maybe has head coaching experience, if they are looking, a lot of times they'll reach out. Do you think it's okay to reach out to the AD and talk to them? Because I don't think anybody wants to create problems in their current job if they don't need to. I think they should definitely be open and talk to them if they get an interview. But I think before, maybe if there's any mutual interest. And I think that's especially true for guys that are maybe moving from one head coach to the other. If you're ascending the ladder, I think it's a little bit different. But if you are in that spot, is that something you think is appropriate to reach out and kind of gauge interest, see those type of things for the head coach?
Absolutely. And we actually, just to be open about our process, we had a period of time where we had a couple reach out, and one of their main concerns was like, hey, I'm finishing a season in a place I'm invested in, and those kinds of things. And one of the things we actually did was we shut down so when we posted and we took our applicants in, we normally, like all of admin at all schools have access to that system. We got it shut down so that there were literally my principal, myself, and our district AD were the only 3 people who could see who had applied. Because there were people who had concerns, like, I think at this point I'm interested, and, we had an early date, and it was still during the season, but, we were like, absolutely, we can close this down, we can keep this quiet until it's time to have a full conversation about it. And that way they were in the process, they had done those. But I think the other part is when you're looking, particularly if you're looking to leave a head coaching job you have, you're looking for what are the benefits to this job? What is it really like? And I think it's really appropriate to reach out, to ask those questions. One of the things I did in a lot of them is I was pretty generic in my first response, like, want you to apply, blah, blah, blah. And then I would say, do you have any specific questions? So that I could answer if somebody was like, well, are you looking for somebody in January or are you looking for somebody in July? There were those kinds of questions. There were questions about, just how does your athletics budget work? So I think it's really relevant because you don't need to create a whole stir if you're in a good place, but you're just wondering what's out there that might be a better opportunity. And I think that's human nature, right? Like, do you really want to hire a coach who doesn't think at some point, like, I want to make the best, I want to be at the best level, I want to compete, I want to do those things. So we dealt with some of that. We dealt with some of, we're 5A, right? So you're going to see some guys in 4A who are like, well, this is a chance to step up. You're going to see, we're kind of a unique situation where you see some guys who are kind of in rural areas that like the rural area, but they're like, well, Maricopa's kind of there, but it's also 35 minutes to Phoenix, and you're not dealing with hours and hours of bus trips all the time, although we go to Tucson to play a lot right now, so we'll see how that all plays out. But yeah, I think it's very relevant to reach out, include your resume, those kinds of pieces.
I know all about bus trips. We had 2 3.5-hour ones this year, and a minimum for us is usually 9. If we get to play a team on the west side of Phoenix, we're 90 minutes, but unless Bradshaw is an away game, our bus trips are going to be long. So
right.
Talk to a couple different ADs, and I thought this was interesting, and I think this might depend on the job and maybe where the program is at in certain things, but certain guys have said, what are you looking for in terms of that resume? Because I think it's important for coaches to be honest with themselves if they're ready to take that next step in that process. And one of the things that was interesting to me is I heard from a few guys that said, for example, let's say you got somebody that's a coordinator at a big-time program. Is that heavier on the list than maybe somebody that was a head coach at a 4A or a 3A school? But they've been a head coach at the varsity level. Gotten different answers, which is something I thought was interesting, and that obviously could depend job to job. But what were you guys thinking in that process?
There's no question. You're looking at a certain pool, and there are certain guys that would jump out to you. They picked up the phone, they called you and said, hey, I'm interested in coming. Like, you'd be jumping on that in a heartbeat. But one of the things that we looked at a lot and this is part of what we put in our job description, was that I was looking for somebody who could work with a pretty diverse um, student population. And we are really unique in the fact that you see a lot of, like, I spent 16 years teaching at South Mountain, and South Mountain is very minority driven, but it's one, and then you'll have pockets of other. Maricopa is, we look a lot like the general population. What you would see in a, it's a very diverse group. It's a very diverse group socioeconomically. It's a very diverse group racially. Everything from kids coming off the reservation to, to our group of, as we'd always say, there's always a group coming in cowboy boots and cowboy hats. That's part of who we are. So that was one of my big things, was that, and you could look up, right? And you're like, hey, here's the hottest coordinator, and I live in Gilbert, so here's the hottest coordinator coming off Basha or Hamilton or Perry or, that. And the question is, does that fit with what you've got? Do they have the experience working with that population? Because I think that's a big piece. One of the things I told myself when I started as an AD, and part of it was personal experience, watching things go through, I didn't want to dismiss assistants who were waiting for their shot. I didn't want to dismiss that, because I think so often, you look at professional sports, college sports, everything across the board, right? How many opportunities do people get to, here's your second shot, here's your third shot, and I'm not saying that there's a lot of coaches who aren't deserving of that. But in my mind, looking at, hey, here's a guy who's been 4-6 his last 3 years at this school, and before that he was at this school and he was between 3-7 and 5-5. After a while, you're like, is that just the trend, or does it depend some on the school? So you do have to do your homework, I think, on where they've been and those pieces. But when we came down to it, we felt in most cases that the assistants that were out there that have applied had more upside to us than anybody who was coming from another program. And it's an interesting perspective, because Maricopa has kind of hired from within before. That's kind of what they've done the last little bit. They've taken some shots way out. What we really wanted was somebody who we thought knew what Maricopa looked like, and had some upside, some real, like, how I'm going to look at all their assistant stuff and what does this mean when they become a head coach? Because I don't care what sport it is, you think you're prepared to be a head coach until you become a head coach, and then it smacks you in the face. We have, as Mike Tyson says, everybody's got a plan until you get punched, right? Like, that's the reality of it. So I think you're looking for those concrete examples of where they could come. But honestly, when I got to that point, DC, OC, wide receiver coach, DB coach, pretty interchangeable to me. I have listened and I've heard some things before, like the concept of somebody who's been a Frosh head coach or a JV head coach. Does that give them, because when you're a head coach, you look to your left, you look to your right, but at the end you gotta make the tough calls when you do, and so I think you're guessing on that part. But having somebody who did the head coach part carried some weight and some lower ones, I think. But for us, I don't know that there's a magic piece, right? Like, I think sometimes the guys who become coordinators are the best X's and O's guys you're going to find on a team, right? As a coach, they're great, and we had a couple of them. But at the end of the day, I was looking for somebody to be the face of my program, and that could do the work in the community, could do the work in the school with other teachers, with somebody who could do all of those pieces.
Well, I have 13 years as a head coach, 26 years overall as a coach, and you really aren't ready until there's a lot. And even now, there's stuff you always get a new situation, regardless of the setting. And there's some that have more than others, definitely. But next thing, and this is, Arizona's in a unique situation because we're an open enrollment state. Depending upon what state anybody's listening, that might be a boundary-driven state. It might not. Arizona, and I know, and this is way back when, because like I said, I actually interviewed in Maricopa. I want to say 2009. It's been a while, but I know one of the concerns was we lose so many kids that are really good athletes that are in Maricopa that leave, and at that time, I think it was the Tempe district and other things like that that had taken a lot of kids. Was that something that you guys were aware of, a guy that would meet that problem head on? And I don't even know, is that still as big an issue as it was back then? Because I know back then it seemed like guys were like, if we can keep everybody here, we've really got a chance to compete right away on a high level because the talent was really high. So elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah, it's a thing. I mean, it's a thing at the level of when I got hired in the district, from the superintendent down to we have a brand new principal, we have a brand new district AD. So myself and the district AD and the principal, all brand new, and that's part of the what are we going to do to keep kids here? Because Tempe Union's come down and bust down. I coached for 20 years in Tempe Union. I was a dean for 2 years. I've seen it. I know it. When I got down here, people are like, we went and played Mountain Point first game of the year. And my head coach is like, that kid's from Maricopa, that kid's from Maricopa, that kid's from Maricopa. I see a kid come out of the stands, and he's walking down to talk to his buddies, and I look, and he's wearing a Basha shirt. I'm like, what's he wearing a Basha shirt for? They're like, he plays up at Basha. I'm like, so it's a real thing. And it was a big part, I think, of our process. The interesting part to that was the two solutions to that, to me, was you bring in a big name coach that kids are like, oh God, I want to go play for. Okay? And that's a tough sell. We had some discussions. I think we were close on some that, had reached out and were interested, and that could have happened. But once outside of that option, to me it comes down to who can become the guy that people want to look at and people want to say, I want to play for that guy. What is his demeanor? And you mentioned the old school part there. I think that's the part that pushed me towards a little bit more of a new school mentality. That who's going to be the guy that's out on social media? Who's going to be the guy that's out talking about what we're doing? We get into the world of recruiting and those things, and I've had some conversations with coaches about that, and we all subscribe to the same theory. The way you recruit is by being the best you can be and letting people know who you are. And I think that's a place where we're behind the times a little bit. We're not quite there. We got a boosters Instagram, or we've got this, but to me, coaches need to be out and connecting and developing so that people know what we're doing, so that those kids who come up say, this is where we want to be. We just had 300 middle schoolers that walked over from our middle school. And my comment when I got to meet them and talk to them is, hey, I can testify that our athletics programs haven't lost to anybody in Maricopa in years, right? Like, this is what we're doing. And you can see the kids kind of, okay, now we still got to battle up the 347. But the way you do that is, we took a step this year. Okay, they expanded the playoffs, but we're there. You got in, right? And so now that becomes a thing. Now the next step is how do we host one of those so that our whole community can come in and see those. And that's a process. So in my mind, it was either you find the established person who's already shown this and can do it, and you call that the luckiest day in your life and you go with it, or you're going to have to find somebody who has the characteristics, the ability, the everything you want to see to be able to convince people that your program isn't the same old Maricopa. And I owe a lot to Tevin as our coach. I mean, he came in and went 0-10 his first year. And 4 years later to be walking out as a state playoff berth, that's a foundation. And so to me, this is our moment. This is our moment to say, how do we get half those kids that are driving up there to stop driving up there? How do we, and eventually we'll get them all. But how do the other kids that could be driving somewhere else say, well, I could drive to Maricopa? And, that's the reality of it. We're open, like you said, we're open boundaries. My last couple years, when I was at Corona coaching, Corona and Desert Vista were like the last two closed boundary schools in the state. People used to be like, "How do you get kids to come play for you?" And I'm like, "They move in, you know." But that's not today. Today is all about what is it that's appealing about you. And the cool part for us is we've got some stuff that my parents have lived down here for 18 years. So I've seen it grow. I've seen those pieces. But we've got a pretty nice setup. I mean, it's a nice concourse. It's a great field. It's got the potential to really be Friday Night Lights stuff. It's a growing city that's a small town feel. And so you got to get those kids that want to grow up. And that was some of our questions in our things when we talked about things like, how do you reach out to youth? How do you develop the youth programs? Because that's a thing here. Because if you're developing the youth programs, then they're thinking, I want to be a Maricopa Ram before they ever think, do I want to be Mountain Point or Corona or Desert Vista or Chandler or any of them. And I think that was part of what we were looking at. And when you saw that, those were kinds of things through it. But when we did our first round of interviews, those were the questions. Questions were, how do you develop? And I think that if I could give a coach any hint in the world, I would say don't overlook any possible angles that might arise. Be prepared for, they might ask me about how do I get youth. They might ask me about how am I going to keep kids eligible. They might ask me about, how am I going to make our program well known. So having that preparation, I think is essential. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know if I would have said that to you in the beginning of October, but with our hire with Casey Day, that's what it was. He was prepared for it all. And so when you asked him a question, he knew where he wanted to go with it.
So let me ask you this, because I think this is any of you guys that are trying to make that move. I think one of the things as a head coach you got to look at is, do the expectations match the talent? If the expectations are to be in the state championship, well, if the talent's here, then those are even.
Right.
If the expectation is to be really good and the talent's here, that's not a job you want to look at. Now,
right.
The best ones are where the expectations are maybe down here, but you're looking and you're going, these guys got some dudes, man. We can go in here and turn this thing right around pretty quick and we'll look really, really smart. So I think it's important that you match that. You also talked about something that when I have done any of these podcasts and talked about this, fit is critical.
Mm-hmm.
The fit is absolutely critical. There's certain guys that fit certain places and they don't fit others. Doesn't mean they're a bad coach, doesn't mean they're a bad guy. I think I fit best here in a rural, small town type of community. I enjoy that fit.
Right.
The city, I was an assistant for a long time, but that wasn't, as a head coach, I didn't think that was a great fit for me. I didn't want to have to go out and compete so hard for my kids. Most of the time here, kids grow up knowing they're going to be a Badger, they're going to be a Bear.
Right.
There's still some of that stuff, but very, very little in our area. So you already talked a little bit about interview questions. So how do you determine in your questions whether a guy is the right fit for your situation? And what are some things that you looked at in just terms of general interview questions that a coach can expect? You talked about it a little, but if you could elaborate a little more, that would be great.
Yeah, so for our first step, we had 6 on the interview committee. Okay, we had our district AD, we had our principal, myself, and then we had 3 coaches who are teachers on staff, all of which have been here for a period of time. Because the other 3 of us were new. So we wanted that kind of balance of it. We had, and just to put all our cards out there, we had our girls volleyball coach, we had one of our flag football coaches, and we had our boys and girls soccer coaches. And part of the reason behind that for us is one of the things I think is an important fit was questions about how are you going to interact with the school community. And so I wanted people that would hear that and say that felt right, that didn't feel right. Or I've heard that before and that kind of stuff doesn't happen. When we did our question list, Our district AD gave us about 16, said, here's just my ideas. What do you think? My principal and I both went through, took some out, rearranged some, but pretty much we worked from that list. And we benefited from the fact that Matt Mayo, our district AD, had been the AD at Seton. He had hired football coaches. He had done that. So, but almost nothing we had in that list was, honestly, it was directly football related. It wasn't X's and O's. It was about how do you interact with the community, how will you interact with boosters. It was questions in my mind that you don't always think of as an assistant football coach. You don't have to do. How are you going to keep kids eligible? It was a lot of questions geared towards the overall program. We did ask, where do you see this program in 5 years? We had a question that Mayo gave me that was, how do you describe a healthy program? Which I thought was a really interesting question because it's very general, but I thought it told you a lot about where their view of it was. Because you'll hear a lot of answers where people, they know what you want them to say. They know you want them to say academics are important, but it's the steps beyond that. But that healthy one gave us a real chance to evaluate, how did they prioritize what they talked to us about? Now, we did have a little open in it that we asked some follow-up questions if we weren't sure on something. But we also asked our questions knowing that the next step in our interview process was going to be a second interview and that we would have some more in-depth things about other parts. So what we were trying to see really was what comes out in that, that initial, this is what my vision is. And that was very interesting because we saw a wide variety of looks, preparations, and those things even in our first interview. I saw everything from, no handout, no vision, nothing, to a 49-page one that laid everything you could possibly ever think about football out. Now, none of those are gonna, in my mind, none of those are gonna win you the job. But what they do is they help you fill in blanks when you miss something for it. One of the things I asked, because I had seen it in all the interviews I went through, is I had a follow-up one that was basically last question was, what's your elevator speech? Give me your pitch. Tell me why you should be the next head football coach. Which I thought was really interesting because one of the hard parts I think of interviewing is you're trying to figure out how to fit in what you want to get out about you. What you know are your strengths. You're trying to fit, how do I fit them into the questions? How do I do that part? And one of the things I think that comes up there is it's really essential to always answer the question. Always don't miss questions because that happened a couple times. And we had ours printed. They went the path they wanted to. And then as soon as we discussed afterwards about somebody, one of the committee would be like, they didn't answer that. And as soon as you don't answer something, people fill in the blank with, it's not important, they got something to hide about that, whatever. And so I think always get that answer out. And then if you want to expand on it some with some of your strengths, go for it.
I heard Kenny Dillingham talk about this, and I think this is a little bit of kind of what you're talking about. There's a really big difference in coaching a team and running a program. Those are two different things. I would venture to say probably most of your guys that you interviewed have had success coaching a team.
Yep.
Have they had success running a program or being a part of a program that was run well is something that I think is something you have to figure out, and that's something that's really, really important. So I think anytime you're interviewing, it's really important that the coach knows he's going to be a good fit there too, and I think there's a little bit of give and take there. So what is appropriate for the coach to ask for? What are things he can ask you guys as the interview committee? Because I always had certain questions that I wanted to know, and one of those as a coach was, I'm I'm not ever going to put anybody in danger or anything like that. I want to know that an AD has my back for, am I going to be in a meeting every time Johnny didn't get, the ball as many times as he wanted, or this, that, and the other? Because those are things that wear head coaches down. And I do, like I said, I do think that part of that is, now if it's a safety thing, I think the AD's got to be on top of that.
Right.
I think part of the AD's job is to deflect some of that. And I think in the interview process for a head coach, you need to know kind of what that situation is. So what do you think is appropriate for the coach to be able to ask of the committee?
So, first of all, talking about your point about having their back on it, when I reached out to some of the guys I knew in general that happy where they are, those kinds of things, and said, tell me what I should be looking for. That was the first point I got from two different coaches. Having an AD that they knew their vision was aligned with them, and that they would, in fact, support them. And I think that is a crucial piece. We asked, we did the same normal thing, right? At the end, do you have any questions for us? Okay, and just so I don't get them wrong here, one of our candidates who handed us a packet said, "Yeah, it's on my last page." And so some of the questions he had, which I thought were really good, what are the top 2 to 3 immediate priorities for the football program? What are the expectations for the head coach beyond coaching? Teaching role, community involvement. What support systems are in place for coaches and athletes? Trainers, academic support. What is the process for hiring assistant coaches? And I think that one is a huge part, because building your staff is everything, right? Like, head coaches, you can have a great head coach, and if they don't have the staff, that's going to be a problem. Asked about the athletic budget and how does fundraising fit in, which I thought was an excellent question. What is the biggest challenge facing the football program right now? And I thought to me, that was the most interesting question of it, because it was exactly what you said. How do we stop kids from driving up the 347? And then long-term vision for the athletic program, not just for the football team, but for the program. Now, what worked for me on those was a lot of those questions were driven towards big picture program, which is important, I think, because I think you benefit each other. And that's why I wanted other coaches on that committee. But I also want my other coaches to understand that supporting football helps drive what football does, and that helps drive what you want to do. Because when player A comes in to play football, and his sister comes in to play volleyball, and his other brother comes in to play soccer, those all happen. Same way, if sister comes in to play volleyball, may bring brother. But football drives a lot of that, and I think that was kind of interesting to me, just thinking big picture about the athletic part. But I thought there were some really good questions he had in there, just about like, these are the things that I want to make sure it's a good fit for me. And so I think that's essential. Like you said, you don't want to take a job where you're set up for failure, right? I mean,
100%. It was interesting too. David Kleka, who we had on from Mesa High, talked about, he said he wanted to know what they were thinking in terms of bringing in a staff, and whether there was teaching positions they could look at getting guys in there, because it's very difficult to fill a staff. And he said, I didn't want to spend all my time filling a staff. So does this guy have people he can bring in, or what's his plan to go about doing that? Because there's a lot of guys that want to coach or want to be seen on the sideline on Friday night.
Hey.
How are you going to put a good staff in place? Because you already said it, and it's 100% accurate. The head coach is very important, but you have to put in a good staff to be able to be successful, and that includes everything. So I think it's really interesting, and I think anytime a guy took over a program that was there and has elevated them to there is really, really, really a good sign for them. The other thing I would say is, and this is a question that I've asked coaches or people when I was in interviews, I think part of the head coach's job is to get the school to the ceiling. And the ceiling can change if you're a public school that's, in my opinion, doing it the right way and not out recruiting. I'm not talking
Yeah.
about trying to keep your kids.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to take everybody else's. The ceiling's different. A perfect example for us. In 2024, we're 10-2 in the state quarterfinals. Had a chance to be a state championship type team. This year, still reasonably good. 4-6, lost a couple games by one score. But I think the ceiling changes. I think your job as the head coach is to get the program to the ceiling. And I think at different places the ceiling is different. So my question to you is, what is the ceiling for Maricopa football?
That's a good question. I think there's, in my mind, the number one job of an athletic director is to remove the barriers sometimes that keep the ceilings where they are. And so I'd like to say I think the ceiling can go all the way to the top of the elevator. Where's the ceiling right now? As you said, they move. I think it's in a place where we have the potential to take the next couple of steps to get to, because in my mind there's 4 levels in it once you get to state. There's the ability to get in, it's number 1. There's ability to host, which is number 2 to me. There's the ability to get to the state semifinals if things go right. And then there's the ability to think about state championships. And so where would I say I think it is right now? I think we can definitely host. We weren't far. We probably, to be honest, a 2-point conversion at Flowing Wells, and we might have been hosting that first round now. I think with the freshman class we have, that is really good this year. I think by the time they get to their junior and senior years, we're talking about we can host. With the right win, we could get to the semifinals. Once you get there, then you have to establish, you have to start establishing you can get there consistently, and then you get all the other pieces that show up. You get the community involvement. You get the things that come in. First time I met with our booster club, they told me they'd gone and met with, it was Basha and another school, with their booster clubs to say, how are you doing what you're doing? How are you getting there? And I look at ours right now and I'm like, we're not a place where you're trying to get that up off the ground. We're a place where the city will support and put money in and do that, but we're not in a place yet where, we had our first game was homecoming, long story to that, but we had over $6,000 in gate. So, that's packing a place. We're not there where we do that every game yet. But when we do, when we get there, then that I think starts to open up because you give all the other things that attract kids. What do your uniforms look like? What are your team dinners like? All those things are what retain kids and do it because you're taking away this belief that there's greener grass somewhere else. So I think when we look at where ours is, hiring Casey, what we talked about was the next step. And the next step is hosting, and then the next step is getting to that part where, and I always think that the way you get to a step is by beating somebody you shouldn't. You beat somebody you shouldn't, and you get in the playoffs. You beat somebody you shouldn't, and you host a game. You host a game, and you beat somebody you shouldn't. That's how you do it. And that's where the coaching comes down. That's where the staff comes down. I'll be honest with you, I totally stole the staff thing from Kleka and that when he made that comment. I was like, that is so on. What we did was we did our first interview, then we did an inbox in between, and I asked them to give me what their staff would be. And I said, you're not married to this. You can leave something as a TBA, but I'm curious. Who on our staff are you keeping? Who are you bringing in? And I'm like, I wanted to see that process. And that process made a difference. Because there were guys on our staff that I think the consensus was they've spent their time here and it's time to go somewhere else. And I saw that reflected in our candidates once. I had an interesting situation where I had 3, I guess you'd call semi-internal finalists, 2 that were working here. 1 wasn't on staff, had been on previous staffs at some really good programs. 1 that works here and had a DB role coach, and 1 that was a wide, But what was interesting is when they started putting their staffs together, they had each other on them, which told me a lot, one, about the level of the guys we were looking at, but two, the level of somebody being willing to hire other good football coaches to be on their staff. Not being intimidated by, oh, I have to be the smartest guy in the room. Because if you're worried about being the smartest guy in the room, then whatever your level is maxed out by you. Whereas if you're willing to hire other good coaches, and there are tons of good coaches, and there are other good coaches that want to eventually be head coaches. But I think that's a big piece on how you establish where's our max. And so to me, going through this process, I feel comfortable pushing it up a little bit because I think we made a hire of somebody who wants to bring good people and surround himself with good people on campus. And that was a question about it because, the comment was made in one of the parts was that you now have people who are spending 7 or 8 hours a day on your campus interacting with your football players, building relationships in the classroom with other sports, other things. And that's important. There were some lists that had some guys that are currently on our campus that they wanted to put on the staff because of some of those connections and some of those pieces, which I found interesting. Being 4 months in here, I don't know everybody on our teaching staff still. And people come in, you're like, that's an interesting perspective. So I think that's the one piece that I think a coach really controls in what that max cap is how willing are they to bring in people that can help them win that one game that you need to start resetting that level. And then, like you said, you can get here, and then a group of kids comes in and it drops back down here. But how are we gonna climb again?
And I think that's important that the head coach and the AD are on the same page in that regard. And what you said is a little bit like the chicken and the egg. What the ceiling is for you guys is going to depend on who can answer that question of who's leaving.
Yeah.
If we get all of them here, then the ceiling's in a different spot.
Right.
If we can't, it's that becomes a battle, and that's something that is difficult. So in establishing that, you talked about establishing feeder programs, and I know that's such a big deal in the Valley. What does a coach do you think that's important in establishing a feeder program that gets those kids wanting to be Maricopa Rams? How involved can he be in the youth program? All those type of questions. What is something you think in that regard?
I'll tell you, one of the things that Casey said that really got me was his first step into the youth programs was to run clinics with coaches. Not with kids. It was to get coaching clinics in, to start sharing, this is what we do. These are the things we want to build. This is what's there. He goes, it helps me in the community to understand who's really good at what they do, that I can go back and I can watch a youth program and say, look at that. They're establishing, they're building things that we are talking about. He talked about the fact that starts to create different things, even if it's little terminologies and ideas that kids are growing up with. And that helps. We've talked and we've done some before, but we've talked about like theme nights for our home games. Things like youth football nights, having kids come in. We talked some, and our district AD has talked some about us running summer camps, but not only summer camps with our coaches, but summer camps with our players helping out. So that all of a sudden you have this kid who looks up and is like, I want to be just like him. And so when you see those highly functioning places where you see it, in my mind, like when you look at a college world, right? And I've seen programs where after games they're signing posters for kids and they're giving out stuff and they're creating heroes. And I think that's a big piece of what we can do here, because for the most part, those kids aren't thinking about leaving until maybe middle school, but high school in a lot of cases. So we have them. They're a captive audience here. They should want to be on a Friday night watching us. And we should be doing everything we can to get them in to support that. Because I think then you grow up thinking more and more about those schools. And that you have to be better about it. It used to be in the big cities. Like I grew up, I was a Dobson High kid. I was going to be a Dobson High kid. That's what was going to happen. Hey, see? So, like, that's what you were going to do. And so you never thought twice, right? Like, that's just what you went and did. Well, those things start changing, and now I'm like, I think this is one of the things public schools miss is they forgot that we have to appeal to people. We now have to be a marketable thing. We have to be something that people want to be a part of. And in my mind, and I said this in every interview I did for an AD position, 3 factors make a kid want to come to your high school. Academics. What does it look like when they drive by or they visit on campus? And what are your activities and athletics that kids want to come be a part of? Because you can go, and no disrespect, my mom's a math teacher, but you can go sit in a math classroom anywhere in any school, right? But you're not going to have the same experience in sports, in what your dance program is, what your theater program is. And so when you build those things, that's what makes kids want to say, I want to stay here. And I want to stay here with my friends.
I was a Mustang. I should preface that.
Yeah.
I was a Mustang and a Charger. We moved at various points in high school. I was a Dobson Mustang, Rhodes Junior High, and
Yes.
then I ended up being a McClintock Charger.
So-
My uncle coached there a little bit later, and that
So-
was interesting stuff there.
When were you there?
I graduated in '99.
Okay. So see, I watched Dobson win their state championship because the McClintock kids came over in TC and Toby Wright. And so I was late 80s, early 90s.
I coached with Toby Wright and
Did you?
TC, as a matter of fact, because I coached at Dobson for a long time. But anyhow, the other thing you said there that was really interesting and I think is important for coaches, the budget scenario varies incredibly from school to school. Like, I'll give you an example here at Prescott. We're a completely self-sufficient program. We do not have an athletic budget, period. We bring in money from ticket revenues. Now, we're very fortunate. We have a very, very generous community. We always do very well on fundraisers. So we're fine in that regard. But there's certain schools that I've heard different things in terms of the budget and in terms of that process and asking what you can bring in. So the other thing I would say, if you're a coach and you get a job, that honeymoon period is a time to ask for things, and maybe they say no, but that's a time to ask for things. The other time to ask for things is after you had a big year. If you just took Maricopa to the state semifinals, I think you can maybe go into Coach Smith and go, hey, can we maybe looking at this? If you win 3-7, I think I'd probably avoid those questions for a stretch there. But I really, especially, I thought you offered such a fresh perspective because you guys just went through this process. And coaches out there, really listen to these episodes because I think there's a lot of valuable information out there. And again, while you're doing that, please like and subscribe to the show because it helps us reach more people. Our only goal is to reach more coaches and try to help guys in this process. I know you're an Arizona guy. You know that the teacher shortage is real here. And from what I understand, the young coaches shortage is there as well. So our goal is to help as many guys as we can that are coming up, just like guys helped you and I as we were coming up in this coaching thing, because I really do think it's a wonderful job. But I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us. And I look forward to following. That's been one of my favorite things is getting to talk to people now. There's a lot of schools you can follow, and I will certainly be following the process and the growth of the Maricopa Rams athletic program as a whole, and specifically the football program. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate your time, appreciate the opportunity. And, you know, I think if I had to sum it all up for coaches, be prepared, really be prepared, do your homework on the place. And that, what you just mentioned comes across the board. We are one of the fastest growing districts in the state, and that made a difference. Because I know I've got some things to offer down the road, whereas, you know, pay attention to what's out there because I think it's essential when you look for that first job that you get a job that you can be successful in. That's because otherwise you're not set up for success after that. So appreciate your time, love it, keep following so I can steal ideas from guys like Kleka and figure out how to do this job. So.
Well, thank Thanks a lot. We'll see everybody next time for another edition of the Blue and Gold Gridiron Show.